Hello, everyone. It's good to be back with you again as we look at the last portion of Philippians. We'll be finishing it up after today, and the last section we're going to look at will not take us very long to get through. I suspect we'll probably be done in 10 or 15 minutes. So this will be the last segment on Philippians, but also I'm going to be transitioning to a new study. I will be looking at some Psalms in particular coming up, but it'll be a couple of weeks from now before I begin to do that study. So this will be the last online Bible study for a couple weeks, and when we start up again, it'll be in Philippians. So today what I want to do is I want to look at Philippians chapter 4, starting at verse 10, and then running all the way through verse 20. And basically the rest of it just closes out the letter. So just that section right there. Again, it will not take us very long to look at this. It's pretty straightforward. And we are at the end of the letter. So basically what happens at an end of a letter, in particular, this would be a Christian letter or a secular letter at that time frame. They all follow this basic format, and that at the very end, generally, the letter writer will give some indication of his future plans. It could be to come visit. It could be to make travel arrangements or whatever. So there'll be something like that presented. And then also, there could be some kind of a statement about the general welfare of the letter writer, or you could even have some kind of concern being expressed for the letter addressees. In this instance, we have Paul basically sharing about his welfare. And most of it has to do with the financial support that he's receiving from this church in Philippi. And so this is where we're at right now. So we'll be dealing with this financial support and talking about what that means as we're working through this text. So in verse 10, he talks about rejoicing again. And so this rejoice, as we've said, runs through the entirety of Philippians. It's a word that's used abundantly. And so Philippians is a very positive letter in that there's a lot of positive exhortation being presented, and not a lot of scolding or chastisement going on by Paul. This is a pretty good church. Now, about the church in Philippi, as with most of Paul's churches, they would not have been a very wealthy group. Most of the time, we are dealing with people who are on the lower end of the financial ladder. When he talks about this giving and stuff and they're not being able to give at certain times, it's probably because of their financial constraints that are placed upon them just because they don't have a lot. But again, he says in verse 10 that he's rejoicing. He talks about doing so in a more than just a general manner, but in a very, very zealous manner, a great way is what he says, really, that he's very, very joyous. And he's rejoicing because this church has they've sparked that's probably not the right way to say it, but their concern for Paul has been ignited again. They're thinking about him again. Now, again, this doesn't mean that they forgot about Paul or they grew angry with Paul and there was a breach in their relationship. That is not what's going on here. Remember, Epaphroditus has come from this area, probably from Philippi himself, from that area, and or Philippi itself, I should say. He came from that area. He went to go see Paul while Paul is being imprisoned for this. He's under house arrest as he's waiting to see Caesar. He's appealed his case to Caesar. But Epaphroditus has come. He's brought something to him, some financial support. He's brought him some information, and now Paul is sending this letter back. So he has received this financial support for them, and he's very, very happy about it. And as I said before, this is not a wealthy group, so their ability to help is limited. So it's very likely that they could help at a certain point in a year or however you want to look at it, time period, and not be able to do it again for quite some other time. They're just not abundant in financial support, but they do help out for all that they can. Now, there's another church that's mentioned. It's mentioned in verse 16, or another city, I should say, Thessalonica. And these two are interesting. Philippi and Thessalonica are interesting in that they both come from the Macedonian region. So Macedonia is a Greek region, basically northeast of Greece. And they're very, very related. They're Greeks and the Macedonians are closely related. But the church in Philippi and the church in Thessalonica are in Macedonia. So this is where the church first begins in Europe, is in the underbelly, or in Macedonia. So he's talking about these two churches in this sense, but he's highlighting what is going on in Philippi. So in verse 11, 12, 13, kind of all go together, but verse 14, I know you're going to, or 13, I'm sorry, you're going to know it very, very well, depending on what translation you're looking at. I think the NIV, at least the older version, used to say something to the effect of, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And it's something to that effect. It says, I'm able all things in order to be strengthened, or something, to strengthen me, to empower me. Something to that effect. So, interestingly, there's nothing there, or I guess I probably inserted Christ there. I guess the verse actually says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So there might be some translations that have the Christ in there. I doubt it, but even him is not there in the original Greek. It's just talking about being able to do something because you've been empowered. And obviously the empowerment is coming from somewhere, and in Paul's instance it's a good guess, a good origin would be from the Lord himself. So it's not a problem to say that. But the way that verse 13 is used is really the problem. So we'll get to that here in just a second, but I want you to understand that this is all constrained by finances. So it's not saying you can just do anything. Now, so in verse 11, he talks about that he's not in need anymore, that he's received what he has, and he's very happy with what they have given him. He's content with what he's having them. So he's really expressing thanksgiving, which he did earlier in chapter 1 also, but he's very grateful for what they can do, even though it is limited. He is very grateful in what they can do. And Paul's ministry, whenever he works from financial support from his churches, there's no doubt about that. He's always asking them to support him. In fact, Corinth will help out in a mission effort to Jerusalem, but also help out with Paul's ministry effort. Philippi, obviously, we have here, and also Thessalonica, and the other churches too. And when he was not able to sustain himself from the support, maybe the support dried up or something else happened, he had to use it in some way that he wasn't expecting, he could fall back on a trade, and he worked in leather. He was a leather worker. So sometimes we know that he actually would participate in a trade in order to bridge the times whenever that he didn't have the support coming from the churches. And then when he received the support from the churches again, he would go back into basically full-time ministry in a sense. So kind of went up and down for him, but he was always trying to make himself available to do ministry in whatever situation he could do it in. If he didn't have to apply a trade in order to survive, if he was had a good supply of financial support at the time, then he could dedicate himself strictly to the gospel ministry. But we also know in the book of Acts, specifically like chapter 18, that when things are not going well as far as the finances are low or they're gone, that Paul can apply a trade and he can carry himself through this difficult time. So he knows about being content and having enough and not having enough. In fact, that's what he says in verse 12. He talks about being humble in verse 12, but when you're thought of as being humble, actually the idea is to be humbled in a sense. Something is humbling you. He knows how to be humbled, and to be humbled would be a time when you no longer have this kind of means that you have to go out and do some work for yourself or something to that effect. I mean, he knows what it means to be, and I'm using language that kind of reflects more of today and not that time, but he knows what it means to be a working class person. You have to understand that the wealthy at that time did not work. And at this time, a lot of them don't also, but again, Paul doesn't stop him. He knows he can be happy with very little or with a lot. Now, I do think, and this is not, we can't go anywhere in Scripture in the New Testament and give us some direct information. But I do think that this might be a good indication that Paul did come from a family that probably was wealthy. We can go back to the Roman citizenship, the fact that he was a Roman citizen, knowing what the exchange that he has with the Roman centurion in Acts, I think it's Acts 21, I think, 21, 22. That the Roman centurion says that it cost him a great deal to become a citizen, and Paul says to him that he is a citizen already. So kind of the Roman centurion, marvels at the citizenship of Paul. But Paul is a citizen, but it kind of reflects that it probably took a lot of money for him to be able to, for them to buy their redemption price. We know the centurion, it cost a lot. We can surmise that it cost a lot for Paul's family too, which had happened prior to this event. We don't know when, but he was a Roman citizen. He was able to study under one of the most famous and notorious rabbis of that time, Gamaliel. The fact that he was able to leave his home and come down here and study full time, again, is an indication. He probably could have been very, very wealthy. But regardless, when he becomes a Christian, things change. And so he understands how to be in a state of contentment because he has Christ in his life. If he has financial support, or if he doesn't have financial support, he will make it through. He says, I know how to be humbled and I know how to abound, is what he says. So I know what it's like to be down here at the very lowest end of the rung as far as financial security, but he also knows what it's like to be at the top part, or somewhere where you could say that he was more secure. But anyway, he knows these things. And then he goes on and talks about more things, about having plenty and hungering, abundance and need. And so Paul, as long as Paul has Christ in his life, and this is the way it should be for us too, as long as we have Christ in our lives, we should not be looking for more materials to make our life happy. We don't need more things in our life. We need more of Christ in our life. And when we can do that, then we truly will have contentment. Now again, this is about finances. So, verse 13, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. I've seen it on ball players, football players. I remember one person had it under their eyes here with some black tape that said Ephesians 4:13 there. And it was a football game, and it just gave people the wrong idea. The idea that he can participate in this ball game and be successful, maybe be injury-free, whatever, just because he has Christ with him. Well, that is not what this verse is saying. This is not a verse that you go to and say, hey, I always wanted to do that marathon. I think I'm going to do it now because I know Scripture says I can do all things through him who gives me strength. This is not what this is saying. It is strictly talking about these financial constraints here. Now, that doesn't mean that God can't do all things. Obviously, God can do all things. All I'm saying is chapter 4, verse 13, is only within the confinement of finances. That's where we need to keep it. And so he's talking about how he can perform his ministry, how he can live day to day, so forth and so on. He will be content no matter what. Verse 14, he talks about he's very grateful again for their sharing in the trouble with him. This church in Philippi is probably, church in Thessalonica and Philippi probably are the two churches that are the best for Paul. They seem to be the most generous towards him. They seem to have been given him the least amount of grief. And so these two churches are really, really good. And so they have found out about his trouble and they're sharing in it also. They're not only giving financial support, they've sent Epaphroditus to make sure that everything is going all right. In fact, in verse 18, Epaphroditus comes up again. They also have sent he's aware of their prayers, that's what I should say. And so he is very pleased with his relationship with this church in Philippi. So he talks about how he was having trouble raising money, but the Philippians were right there willing to help him as far as financial support. And then in verse 16, he talks about Thessalonica again. So these two churches, again, were very, very helpful, beneficial in his ministry. Other churches were too, but these were they were helpful. They initiated it right at the beginning, and they continued with Paul's ministry. And so he's had a pretty good relationship with these churches for probably, it's hard to say how long at this time. I suspect probably by the time he writes this letter that he has had a missionary relationship, an apostolic relationship with this church for probably at least 10 years. So he does know these people fairly well. He's been there several times. In verse 17, basically the gift is not going to make him think any higher of these people. He already thinks very highly of them because he just loves them just sincerely with Christian love. So it's not that this makes them any higher priority in his mind or anything to that effect. It's that he just knows that his relationship with them, if they sent something, he's going to love them. If they don't send anything, he's going to love them also. So it's not like they need to send him things for him to have a pleasant disposition towards them. No, he loves this church. Verse 18, he talks about receiving the full supplies, whatever it was he had. Talks about payment, but they're not getting money necessarily. Now, there could be some money brought. Now you got to think about traveling with money too. If Epaphroditus is traveling, and I don't think this church is very wealthy, I doubt that he has any kind of security going with him. So it's unlikely that he's going to carry a lot of money. Most people, it was dangerous to travel back then. A lot of highway robbers out there, and so a lot of criminals doing things, a lot of thievery. But so whatever he brings to him is very helpful, and Paul says he's well supplied. And here we have it. Epaphroditus brought it to him. And so he talks about how this is pleasing and how, because of their partnership in this ministry, verse 19, that God is going to bless them also for what they do. And then he closes out with a glory being given to the Father. So after that, basically Paul closes out the letter. And there's only a couple more verses after that. So that's really about the end of it, of what happens there. So I hope you've enjoyed this study in Philippians. Again, I'll be taking off a couple of weeks, and then after that we'll be doing something in the Psalms. So please come back in a couple of weeks. I'll have it up on the Facebook page again when it begins, and we will do about 2 months, 2 to 3 months on some interesting Psalms coming up. So I hope you have a great Thursday, and I will plan on seeing you on Sunday. Bye.